A New Zealand anti-whaling protester is being held on a Japanese whaling ship after climbing on board that boat.
It's the latest incident in a series of long-running disputes between the Japanese whalers and activists in the Southern Ocean. Don Rothwell is a professor of international law at the Australian National University, and he joins us now from Canberra. Professor Don Rothwell, good morning.
Good morning, Joe.
Now, this protester's name is Peter Bethune. Could he legally be held on this Japanese ship and then transferred, say, to another Japanese boat and taken back to Japan and tried in Japan?
Well, look, I suspect, Joe, that there are laws in Japan which deal with improper, unauthorised entry onto Japanese-flagged vessels. These are not international laws, it needs to be said, but Japanese laws. And so if Japan does determine that they are going to prosecute Bethune, yes, the scenario that you painted is highly likely.
There have been protesters jump on board Japanese ships before. I remember one incident in particular, but as far as my memory goes, that they were actually released back to the protest ships and came back to Australia. That they weren't processed through the Japanese courts.
That's right, Joe. In fact, that's the incident from January 2008 where an Australian national and a British national from the Sea Shepherd did board one of the Japanese whalers. But, of course, in that incident, the Oceanic Viking was on patrol in the Southern Ocean, was able to, if you like, diplomatically intervene, and those protesters were transferred off the Japanese vessel back to the Oceanic Viking, who then returned them to the Sea Shepherd vessels.
So in this situation, with no independent boat in the area, it's possible that this Pete Bethune could end up in Japan.
Yes, and there's also been statements, I think, made by Sea Shepherd in which they've indicated that they don't wish Mr Bethune to be returned to them. He was apparently boarding to either effect some form of citizen's arrest or to present some bill as a result of the sinking of the Ady Gil back in January of this year. So I think Sea Shepherd and apparently Mr Bethune are quite determined that he will remain in Japanese custody and face the force of Japanese law.
And most probably convicted in a Japanese court.
Yes, I would suspect so, unless he can form some form of defence, but it's most unlikely on the facts as they exist at the moment. What will be of interest is whether or not the Japanese seek to charge him with some form of maritime terrorism, but there's no evidence to say that he was seeking to commit an act of violence or seek to damage the vessel when he boarded it.
What's the situation now with the case of the Ady Gil?
Well, the Ady Gil sinking is still under investigation both by the Australian Maritime Safety Authority here in Australia and also New Zealand authorities. There's been nothing reported yet as to the outcome of those particular inquiries, so we're still waiting to see what is going to be determined. I think what will be perhaps the most important will be the way that the New Zealand authorities view this case, given that the Ady Gil was a New Zealand registered vessel. We know that it sank. If there's going to be the potential for any prosecutions, either civil or criminal, they would most likely be occurring in New Zealand, I suspect.
Do you think Australian authorities should be making any efforts to try and get Pete Bethune off this Japanese boat?
Well, I'm not completely sure where this incident occurred, but I will assume that it has most likely taken place within the Australian Search and Rescue Zone in the Southern Ocean, which is where the Japanese have been conducting their whaling operations this year. Australia certainly would have an interest in this particular incident. Mr Bethune is not an Australian national, so to that extent Australia is a little bit removed from it. But I think Australia would certainly be concerned about the incident, and I think it just highlights the fact that if the Oceanic Viking had been in the region, as the opposition has called for and I called for back in January, they might have been able to diffuse this type of situation and some of the other violent incidents that have occurred between Sea Shepherd and the Japanese whalers over the last few weeks.
You say diffuse, but surely they weren't going to stop incidents like this happening.
No, but I think that the point is that they would be able to intervene to try to seek to resolve the tensions in the manner that I've described from 2008.
Yeah. Now, these incidents will continue until some diplomatic solution can be found or the federal government takes action in the international courts, which you've called for before. How do you feel about the federal government not having gone to the international courts already?
Look, I think it's been entirely legitimate that the Rudd government has sought to pursue diplomatic actions to try to resolve this matter. And in fairness to Minister Garrett and Australia's initiatives before the International Whaling Commission, they really have been quite innovative. But the reality is that Japan hasn't been very responsive to those. I think ultimately Minister Garrett indicated in January that Japan does have perhaps one last opportunity to diplomatically respond to some of these approaches by Australia. And so the June IWC meeting will really be, I think, the line in the sand where the Australian government will have to firmly decide whether Japan is committing in good faith to the reform of the International Whaling Commission, and if it's not, I think the onus will then very much be on the Rudd government, given its public statements, to take Japan to an international court to halt the whaling operations for the 2010-2011 whaling season.
OK, Don Rothwell, always good talking to you. Thanks very much.
You're welcome, Joe.